Was asked to share a little bit this morning, and let me preface it. You know, there's that verse in Ephesians where he talks about giving apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body. And I preface it by saying, because I'm going to tell some stories today, I never want to get up and tell a story for the sake of telling a story. If I tell anything, I pray that it's for perfecting of us all as saints, for some sort of work of the ministry, or for edifying the body. So I just wanted to preface it by saying that. So, we should minister from what we know and what we've experienced. So I'm going to share a little bit about what I know and what I've experienced. But I want to first give you the verse that I'm going to be referring to. It's in Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. Hopefully familiar to all of us. And it says, being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. There's and I think we actually might have mentioned it the past few days. There's a verse in Luke, the very end of Luke 52, chapter 2, where it talks about how Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. But then you go to chapter 3, verse 1, and you have him 12 years old in the temple. So what happened in that time? What was God doing? Well, I looked at that, and I thought, and I said, let me share a little bit about what God has done in me, how he's done a good work in me over the years, and where he's brought me to, despite the things that I've gone through. So I think my mother tells me it was 5:08 in the evening. On November 28th, 1967, I came into this world. St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan, and I was raised first few years of my life in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn. But in 1973, we moved to New Jersey. My father wanted us to have a little bit of better life, a place to run around and have fun. And shortly thereafter, we got a knock at the door. And these nice people said, hi, we're Larry and we're Carol Arendis. We live around the corner. We're all moving into this new development. We're going to be having a prayer meeting and some Bible studies, and we'd like to know if you'd like to come and join us. And that was my first experience outside of my very traditional Roman Catholic Italian Brooklyn tradition. So I had, and don't think that I didn't have church in me, but see, that was the problem from the beginning. I had church in me. I didn't have Christ in me. So they started to get together, and I didn't think about this until the other day. I'm pretty sure, and I was young, but I have a pretty good memory for certain things. I'm pretty sure they said we're having prayer meeting first, then they said we're having Bible study or the Word, and then after that we started to get together for outings and fellowship. I didn't realize that till the other day. So some seeds started to get planted in me, but I was young and I didn't understand, and I liked the idea of church and hanging out with the adults more than anything. Around the age of 10 or 11, and I know a lot of people say, I remember the day, I remember the hour, I remember the weather. I don't. I just know it was around the age of 10 or 11. I do know that I made a profession of faith and I gave my heart to the Lord. Now, sounds great, right? God dispensed his life into me. Here's the problem. I didn't have any real discipleship. Remember, I had church, I had a form of religion, but I didn't really have good discipleship. Doesn't mean my parents weren't good parents, doesn't mean they didn't sow good morals into me, but I really didn't have anyone to disciple me. So I went to their Bible studies. I listened for whatever I could understand at that age, but I began again to love church more than I loved God. Go to Galatians with me for a second and look at chapter 1. And look at what Paul says here in verse 14. And it's really the last part of it that I'm focused on. And verse 14 in chapter 1 of Galatians, and it says, and it profited in the Jews religion, and I profited, right, above many of my equals in mine own nation, being more exceeding zealous for the traditions of my father. And you see, that was very much me. I loved going to church. I did. I loved learning all those things. So Catholicism fit me very well, but it didn't change my behavior. But despite that, being confident of this very thing, he who began a good work in me was faithful to perform it. So, around the age of 12 or 13, and please pardon me, because some of this stuff is embarrassing to say, I remember first starting to play around with a lot of over-the-counter medications, pills, liquids, things like that. And, you know, I tell everybody as I look back, the reason you have those warning labels on those bottles is actually because of people like me. Embarrassing to say, but I know I did. Started to steal some liquor from my parents' liquor cabinet when they weren't looking. Because remember, we had that in our house. We had a form of religion, and we went to church, but we had all of those things there. And I still went to church regularly, Catholic church, and you could say I went religiously. I started to sing in the choir. I started to play in the choir. And then I got involved with the charismatic movement there because it was very similar to these nice people who we were fellowshipping with. But my father kind of pulled us away, and his response, and I didn't understand this till many years later, he said, you know, you don't leave your religion. And see, what he was saying was not you don't leave Christ, he was saying you don't leave Catholicism. That was his religion. And I understand it much more now. But as I got involved with the charismatic movement, I started to go to more Bible studies, even though we pulled away from that group, and being confident of this thing, that he who began a good work in me was being faithful to complete it. The Lord was still doing work in me, and I started to get some discipleship. And at that time, you were able to meet, actually, or at least we did, in the public schools. We had prayer in the morning, we had Bible reading, and one of the sons of the pastor, Dave, was actually the one who was leading things. But you know, you can't lead a double life. And I kind of walked a little bit of a line, you know, so I had my foot in over here, but I had my foot in over here. Well, I graduated, and I went on to college, and I am not necessarily down on higher ed, but here's a warning to maybe the younger people who are considering any form of college. I went to college and I had no restraints. So think about that. I didn't have great discipleship. I'm walking a line. I've got two natures in me, if I can use that expression, and I have no restraints. Look at Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And I'm going to read, let me see. Is it 1 Thessalonians? That's Timothy. I went too far. Nope, it's chapter 4. I do apologize. It's chapter 4. And take a look, and I'm really focusing on the first verse and the fourth verse, but I'm going to read 1 through 4. He's talking to the Thessalonians here. Furthermore, then we beseech you, brethren, and exhort you by the Lord Jesus, that as ye have received of us, and I want to highlight that, as you've received, because I received some contradictory things, you know, so I had that working in with me. Ye ought to walk and to please God. Now, how can I please God if I got 1 foot over here and I got 1 foot over here? I've got this sown into me this way, but this sown into me the other way. For ye know what commandments we gave you by the Lord Jesus. I knew what they taught me, right? For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from fornication. And then here's verse 4, that every one of you should know how to possess his vessel in sanctification and honor. You see, when I went to college and there were no restraints, I didn't know how to possess my vessel. So I'm going to keep it G-rated with the children. There was women involved. There was booze involved. There was very risky behavior involved. I can't tell you how fast I drove recklessly, completely recklessly with other people in the car. How could I please God if I didn't know how to control myself? If I didn't have that self-control within me? So I had a little bit of a wild time in college, and I recognize now that it was because I wasn't rightly and fully connected with somebody who could properly disciple me and teach me how to possess my vessel, teach me how to act right, teach me really about Christ. But being confident of this very thing, he that which hath begun a good work in me did continue to perform it. So I got out of college, and I started, interestingly enough, to get a little bit more serious. I was around the age of 24, 25. And I can say this, despite all the things that I went through, I do believe that the Lord had led me to my wife at the time, and she had actually prayed, and we were both, more so her, but we were both actually given signs to confirm it. We started fellowshipping at a church that taught us more about the Word of God. We, if you can use this word, rededicated. I know we don't always really use that word, but if you know what I mean, kind of repledged my heart to the Lord. And very interestingly, the Lord started speaking to me. So I remember a few instances in particular where he spoke very clearly. One's when I was, I hate telling this story, so I'm just going to tell it very, very quickly. When I was working Department of Corrections in the state of New Jersey, and he told me, while I was speaking to one of the men who was a Muslim, or claimed to be a Muslim, about the Lord, and the Lord, as clear as I am standing here today, he said, "You tell him about me." And I was scared, but I did the best that I could, and then he said it again. He said, you tell him about me. Does anybody here, I don't know if anybody's worked in the prison system, you know what Big Yard is? And they go, okay. So they called out Big Yard, and he went to do his exercises. 20 minutes later, they're all walking back. I said, "What are you guys walking back for? You look forward to this all week long." We were doing our workout. Stephen was on the basketball court. He fell out. They called a code and said, "Everybody back. We think he had a heart attack." 20 minutes later, literally, I hate telling that story, but 20 minutes later, he passed away. He went into eternity. Now, I don't know for sure if he listened and accepted the Lord based on what I said. The Lord's still working with me on that. But the point is that the Lord started to speak to me, even in my marriage, and I don't want to get into that today. Things didn't go so well, but let me tell you, I remember the day that I was in ShopRite, it's our supermarket up there, with my eldest daughter, and I remember clearly, I was in the aisle, he said, "Go home, this person's in your house." And she was already starting to get involved with other people, and sure enough, I left ShopRite, I went home, and there that person was in my house. Not a great time, embarrassing time, but the point is, again, the Lord started speaking to me at that point. I went through my situation in the marriage, but the nice thing that came out of that is that drove me to my knees. That really pushed me further, and I started to pray more, and I started to seek out better teaching, and the Lord was so good, because every time that I did, he always led me to somebody else who could take me to that next level that I needed to be at. And during that time, sure enough, that's when I met Pastor Parks. Now, I met Pastor Parks, for those of you who don't know, because at the time I had taken my year off after the divorce, and I started to see somebody. It was Pastor Parks' partner, Linda, and she said, "Boy, you sound like my pastor, my business partner. You need to meet him." I walked in the door, tried to shake his hand. Of course, he said, "We don't do that. We hug each other." I said, "Well, that's wonderful. Great. I'm a hugger too." And then the first thing out of his mouth is, "I'm not black and you're not white, and let me tell you why." And the funny thing about it was, I listened to this man, and I knew immediately he was right. And I've told everybody, the literal words that ran through my mind were, "This guy is the smartest guy I ever met in my life." Now, it took me a few days to really kind of get the scriptures to understand that part, but I got the concept, and I started to grow. I started to hear from the Lord. I started to grow. I started to pray more. my thinking and my doctrine started to change. That's when he started to also introduce us to Ian Bounds, and we all have the Ian Bounds book on prayer. The Lord was being faithful to continue the work that he began in me many, many years ago. Then, in I think it was March of 2022, all of you know Pastor Park passed away. And that really pushed me to another level of prayer and another level of learning. And, you know, it's interesting how you go through trials, right? You go through diverse trials for the testing of your faith. It produces patience, and you let that have that complete work in you, so that you'll be whole and complete. And the inference there, to me, is kind of that you'll be missing something, or you won't be quite complete unless you go through that. So not only did he take away Pastor Parks, but the Cavers were already gone by that time. So we were kind of alone up there, and we had this big building that we didn't need, and we ended up getting rid of the building, and we ended up moving into my house, which is where we currently have the home ministry. But the reason we moved into my house is because I was also having problems with my youngest daughter at that time, and she wanted to rule the roost, and still does, but I let her know no, so she decided to move out. So I said, well, we've got this place here. I said, why don't we move here and just save the rent? We don't need a big building like that. And it was a good move, but let me tell you, it also takes you to a level of faith when you have your home open, and that is where you have prayer. That is where you have service. That is where you have people just traipsing through, use the bathroom, do this, do that. You really, I know it sounds funny, but you have to make sure that your life is right. Let me tell you, I learned that. and God bless him. Pastor Agnew was real good when he came to visit once and pointed out a few things to me, and thank you very much. But you got to stay on your toes. So he who was faithful to begin a good work in me, right, or who began a good work in me, has continued to perform it. Well, since that time, we've gone through some more trials in the ministry. I've gone through more trials. My daughter, who was out, came back, and that was a blessing in some respects, but that was also difficult in other respects. Some people decided to move on, and if you know me, you know it's not about numbers. I don't care about that, but they decided to move on. But God continued to develop me. He continued to push me in my learning, push me in my prayer. I started teaching a little bit more regularly. We have a Friday night Bible study we've had for years, and I started to do more with that. Last conference, I think we had between 8 and 10 people who came to the conference. So God has continued to do that, and I share all of this, not to tell any stories per se, but I hope that in some way you are encouraged, despite the trials that you may go through. Take a look, and I always find retrospect is good. Take a look at what you have been through. Take a look at where you started and what God started in you, and take a look at where you are and how he has brought you through. Look at how faithful he's been, how good he has been to you, and be encouraged. I pray that this has encouraged you. Thank you very much.